So thank you everybody for joining us today. We have a very dear conversation today because we are going to talk about the Elea Way, a book we co-author with Peter Wuffli, and I will tell you a little bit more, but also it's a special day because it's the last meeting, I would say, or the last webinar of 2020. And I think maybe this is the understatement of the year, but it has been really an extraordinary year in every sense of the word. From really full of both, I would say, non-ordinary challenges, but also incredible opportunities. Two of those great opportunities for me that came this year, or that came from 2020, are actually building this community of like-minded people that believe in mobilizing private capital for impact, like yourself, that are here, many of you repeated offenders that are sharing with us all these topics that really want to speed and scale social innovation. And second, and also on a personal tone, and we have our guest to talk today, is the launching of the Elea book that I co-authored with Peter Wuffli. That has been an honor and a very interesting 2.5 years, I would say, process of thinking on the role of philanthropic impact investing in general, and how to communicate the value of philanthropic investing, how to use the breadth of knowledge that the Elea Foundation had in its experience of the last 10 years. And also the honor to work alongside Peter. And you'll have an opportunity today also to make this conversation very lively and to ask questions too. So at IMD Elea Center for Social Innovation, we believe that we are at a very important inflection point, and we really believe on the role of the private sector to lead towards a greener, just and more inclusive and prosperous society. So the webinars that we've been doing discuss precisely different ways of how to address or how to lead in the impact economy. We really believe that the key challenge to address is the concept of impact management. You are going to see in many cases, we talked a lot about impact measurement, but we also want to deal, and it's important to measure impact, and we will talk about that, but also it's important to manage impact. And when we talk about impact management, we think about how asset owners, being that investors, banks, entrepreneurs, corporates, and we have a list of guests in this area, articulate and realize their impact objectives. So we want to think about what problems these actors want to address, who they want to reach, where they want to invest, what risks they want to take. So many of these webinars that we led or we share during this intense year address these type of issues. And we believe that really now is the time for this discussion, and we want this discussion to take center stage. So how we intentionally create and manage impact. And for that, throughout the year, we explore the spectrum of capital. If you remember, we had this graph, and now it's becoming a little bit fancier with more pieces of information, but it's the same that we have shared in the past. And we really explore the many ways that private actors can mobilize resources to spark social innovation. And we have many excellent and very diverse guests. We started the webinars, and these webinars included, for example, exploring how specialized investment funds are explicitly targeting SDGs. And we did this with Jean-Philippe Schrevel. And also we talked about how foundations are becoming more catalytic, leveraging private capital from multinationals to specific SDGs. And we talked about quality education with Fabio Segura. We also explore how ESG criteria are penetrating the investment decisions of institutional investors, of pension funds, of responsible investors. And we had Jaume Iglesias from UBS, Hans Tegeman from Triodos Bank, Steve Friedman from Pictet, Sarah Scaramella, PG, Gar Dijkstra, Christina Tsunes. Like, we could really a long list talking about ESG integration. Also, we learn about how the private sector, public institutions, and nonprofits are collaborating. And we truly believe that collaboration is also another key topic to address. And we dealt in several webinars on the issues of blended finance solutions. And we had Lade Araba, we had Pierre Rousseau, Maximilian Martin, Juan Coderque Galvigo. And we found also, we had also corporates and entrepreneurs, if you want, in part of the spectrum, how promising initiatives like renewable energy purchase agreements. We talked about with Paul Needham. We talked about microinsurance for smallholder farmers with Susana Robledo Reber. And we talked about economics of mutuality with Bruno Roche. So we really have taken a hard look also at the more systemic piece, or the framework, if you want, and the importance of building ecosystems and corresponding networks. And we had Mariano Chola and Sertat Yeltekin telling us about the importance of ecosystems. And finally, last but not least, as we usually say, we explore the many ways that philanthropic impact investors and philanthropic actors, even families or family businesses, are reshaping their charitable activities. Know how they're moving from just grants to philanthropic impact investing or to more catalytic capital. And we have Nicolas Raz, Ian Martin, Mulder, Rita Way, and Julia Balandina Jacquier. And today we're coming full circle because we started with Peter Wuffli, founder and chairman of the Elea Foundation for Ethics and Globalization, and that will be here with us talking precisely about philanthropic impact investing and how it plays a key role to create this pipeline and to address a market gap that is necessary to really bring social innovations to scale. No, and Peter, and as you know from the Elea Foundation, but also if you see the Elea Center for Social Innovation, the Elea Center for Social Innovation comes from a generous donation of Peter and his family. And we have been working together. I'm the proud first holder of the Elea Chair for Social Innovation. And I think we share, and I think that was very interesting in about writing the book together, on the power of bringing together and not looking just at one side, capital with entrepreneurial skills and abilities in order to foster innovation and impact. And Peter is not only the founder and chairman of the Elea Foundation, but he is also an honorary chairman now of IMD, where he was the chairman of the board, I think, for 10 years. So he just stepped down last year. And he previously had a career in consulting. He was a partner at McKinsey and also was a CEO at UBS and a chairman of the board at Partners Group. So I feel and I have a sense that somehow all those pieces of his career, and we talked a little bit about that in the past, really were put together at the Elea Foundation and the kinds of things that he does now at the Elea Foundation. So just as a quick reminder, I forgot to share, you have in the bottom the Q&A piece of the story. So please feel free. We will not have many more slides, maybe just a couple, because the idea is to have an open conversation with Peter and with me too, if you want. So please write your questions at the Q&A. And if you see a question from somebody else that you feel that is very interesting, you can click on like, and that will make the question pop up in the list of questions. And I can include those questions in the conversation. So if you like, click on like, and but feel free to write any questions at any time, so we make this conversation quite interactive. So what we are very proud today, and I think we all have here another copy, is to present to you the book, The Elea Way, A Learning Journey Towards Sustainable Impact. And it was published at the end of November of this year now is available. And again, if some of you have been on several webinars, you can write to me and we'll make sure that you get a copy, because I know many of you have been very loyal to all these webinars, and could be an ebook or a hard copy. You let me know, you can write to our contact at the end. No, but the idea of, or the discussion today, or the different things that we talked in the past, we talked about the definition of impact investing, no? And we said that there was a need to call something different than investing, the traditional investor, because an impact investor was somebody that actively placed capital in enterprises that generated a measurable, desired, beneficial, or social, environmental outcomes that would not occur but for his or her investing. No, so what is the idea? This idea of impact investing has, I would say, that the typical definition or the academic definition, 3 key blocks, and 1/4 one, as you see in the slide. And the first one is, as you say, actively places capital. So it's intentionality. No, so we are going to talk with Peter about all these different blocks and how we bring this into practice. No, how do you make these tough decisions sometimes? On how to invest and how to be intentional. We're going to talk also about measurement of impact, because it's not enough to have good intentions. We need to make sure that those outcomes that we desire happen on the field. And an interesting role, and I think when we talk about philanthropic impact investing, there are different assumptions that when we talk about finance first impact investing, but what is the expectations of returns? And I know that in the case of the Elea Foundation, specifically, they invest in for-profit business. So even though if the return is a philanthropic investor can take different or below market returns if you want, why there are certain expectations, at least for the businesses they invest in, to be profitable and sustainable, and what is the role of returns when we think about impact investing. And last but not least is this idea of additionality. And I think this one is a hard one to prove many times, but a key concept, because we're trying to build a market. So why would a philanthropic impact investor or other investors, if commercial money was already available, if the markets were taking care of certain problems, maybe there wouldn't be a need for this different asset class in a certain way. So how can we build this additionality and de-risk projects that in the traditional risk-return investment decision were not bankable in the past or investable in the past? How do we bring it to market? How do we scale them? And how we start precisely creating this more inclusive type of capitalism? No? So these are the key focus of the conversation today. So thank you, Peter, for being here after this long introduction here with us. And let me just start with a very typical, I would say, initial question. Why writing a book? No, and what is the Elea Foundation, for those that do not know, and why did we decide to write this book after 10 years? So probably a little bit more, no? To say, I think of the foundation, 15 years, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Vanina. Great to be back. Thank you for re-inviting me. I know this is a special privilege if you are invited twice to a community. And obviously, we're both very happy that we reached this milestone in November, a milestone we have worked very hard in the past 2.5 to 3 years, and where obviously the last mile is always the hardest to actually then get it done with all the work that it takes to publish quite a complex topic in a book. So your 2 questions, just very briefly, what is Elea? Elea is a philanthropic impact investor with a purpose to fight absolute poverty with entrepreneurial means. Absolute poverty is less than $3 daily income. So it's not extreme poverty. We're not looking at misery. We're not looking at natural disaster, at crisis situations where people don't have food, don't have shelter, don't have the basic healthcare. But we are looking at this kind of first step where people live poorly, have very limited degrees of freedom to shape their own life, and obviously are looking for ways to improve their livelihoods. So our theme is about increasing income, creating jobs, or providing skills that help to get jobs and to achieve impact. Elea has been founded by my wife and myself 15 years ago. We currently have about 20 active investments in 4 themes. One is global agricultural value chain, one is informal retail and last mile distribution, one is employable skill building programs, and one is digitalization, digital solutions. Why did we write the book? When we were 10 years into our topic, we kind of had a soul-searching phase in 2016. We seriously thought about how would the next 10 years look like. And I guess one of the things we felt is that the topic is increasing in kind of prominence, in relevance. There is an increasing interest, obviously also driven by all the aftermath of the great financial crisis, of looking for ways how to improve capitalism, how to make capitalism more inclusive. And so we felt we are gaining a lot of relevant insights and data and experiences. And as a result of that, also some advice and some recommendations for both entrepreneurs as well as investors and others interested in this topic of an inclusive capitalism. And one of those conclusions was we should actually invest some time and resources into capitalizing on creating our knowledge and on distributing and sharing our knowledge. And as a result of that, we decided to create the Elea Center for Social Innovation at IMD in 2017. We were very privileged to find Vanina, who is a perfect complement to me. We share the same agenda. In many ways, we are about as complementary as you can be. Vanina obviously being a Latin, high passion extrovert, me being more a Swiss, German, American raised type of structured and organized introvert. So we complement each other very well. And so we thought one of the initial projects to actually bring the center alive is to write a book. Books always lead to deadlines. Deadlines are just great because they force you to actually come with some end product at some stage. And they were a tremendously valuable opportunity for us at Elea to kind of reflect on what we did, why we did it, what we learned, what we can generalize in terms of lessons. And it was a terrific opportunity to obviously work together with Vanina, get the academic side. And that's obviously then something I would be interested in your perspective as well, Vanina. What's the value from an academic, from a pedagogical point of view of working in this book and of actually using it? So that's the simple reason. And by the way, of course, I did it because I love writing books and I love writing in general. So I wanted to become a journalist at some stage of my early career. And it's actually my third book, not counting my PhD thesis on Swiss direct investment in Mexico. I wrote a book on inclusive leadership 5 years ago, and one on ethics, liberal ethics, which appeared in German language only 10 years ago.
Good. So as I told you, this was going to be a conversation. Peter replied back with a question to me. So, but I can vouch and say that Peter is really a gifted writer, and it has been a pleasure. And I think, as he says, we complemented well because I think I were part of the research, but Peter too, because you are also a research-minded person, so you've done a lot of research. But what I tried to bring also was a little bit the pedagogical side, the teaching side, because I think this book also has this idea that would become a piece of reflection, that can be inside of a classroom, but also can be in a workshop, in a training, or in other ways. Even at the end of the chapters, we have right versus right decisions, so ethical dilemmas, we have learning objectives, we have different scenarios. So the idea was not to have just a book with theoretical content or research, but also to spark a little bit of critical thinking, because I think the field in this point in time, we are sharing best practices, we are sharing learnings, but it's still a very new field, and we thrive on the debate, I would say. So for me, the interesting part was also to make part of the learnings from the Elea Foundation more generalizable, if you want, on how different asset owners, as we said before, can incorporate impact into decisions. So how do you make these tough decisions about risk, about return, about scaling, about finding social innovation or transforming business models with a North Star that, if you want, is to have certain intentional impact? And we have Andre asking a question, because you were very clear, Peter, that the Elea Foundation focuses on fighting absolute poverty with entrepreneurial means. If you want the intentionality that we talked, is fighting absolute poverty. But he's also asking, do you go to a specific region or geographical location? Because we know that some impact investors say, okay, I will specialize on India or Africa or Latin America. No, what do you do at the Elea Foundation? And this is a decision that impact investors need to make, clearly.
Yes, that was one of the initial decisions that we took. And, our full name of Elea is Globalization, Foundation for Ethics in Globalization. And that name actually came from one of the motivations in setting up the foundation, which was essentially recognize that globalization is probably the trend of our generation, and possibly also the next one or two generations to follow. And we all recognize, and now it's maybe a little bit more obvious than it was 15 years ago, that globalization is a very, very complicated and very challenging process that has a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential for gains, but it also leaves losers. And it is very delicate, because if we don't care for those who did not have access to globalization opportunities, you may have processes that make globalization stop. And I think there are quite a lot of indications right now that some of this is happening. And so therefore, we were really focusing on, since having been born in Switzerland and having been able to make a career as I did, I was on the winning side of globalization. And so the idea of the foundation very initially was essentially to help those that did not have access to globalization opportunities. And we deliberately did not set a geographic focus point. Our geographic areas of focus are determined by the level of absolute poverty. That is less than $3. So as a result of that, we are in countries of the South, not of the North. And the other are practical criteria. So for example, we prefer countries where some of us speak the language. We prefer a minimum of safety. So we don't go into failed states because simply we do intensive due diligence. Typically, we look 6 to 9 months of due diligence, part of it on site. And we want that our associates come back healthily and alive. And so in that sense, we have a few kind of geographic criteria, but the primary criteria are thematic. So we actually look for interesting, innovative, scalable, and impactful entrepreneurial initiatives in these 4 themes that I mentioned before. And that then led to a group of countries where we are engaged on, which in the Asian geography is around India. India is one of our hubs, but we also have an investment in the Philippines, which we describe in detail in the book. In Africa, we have been more around East Africa and South Africa. So Kenya is one of our hubs, but we also have investments in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, in South Africa, and in Latin America, it's around Bolivia and Peru.
Right. So from this, because something we've seen, at least also in research, and something that is discussed in this intentionality, having a thematic, if you want, focus, or even a regional focus for others. But can help you to have some learnings. So is this idea of maybe, and also, can this come also from your financial background of having a more diversified portfolio, maybe having different regions? I don't know. What do you learn from the diversification of regions, but the specific target, thematic targets? Are there specific learnings that you think come out of this vision?
Yes, I think the reason is a combination of strategic guidance and opportunism. The strategic guidance, yes, of course, comes from the fact that we did not set up Elea because I had one awakening in the morning where somebody told me you need to do this or this or this. It was also not a key experience that was life-changing like other kind of philanthropists have, that they had a specific experience in a country or with an organization or with a theme. That was not the case. So it was really a relatively rational and analytic assessment of what could we do. And yes, diversification was clearly playing a role, but also learning from different geographies. For example, we have done employable skill building programs in all 3 geographies, and it's interesting what is similar, what is different. Some lessons you can learn. For example, we had one very successful program where we helped mom and pop shops in Bolivia. Well, there are more mom shops than pop shops because the pops typically are not around. So typically they are run by moms with 2 to 4 kids. And so this program was spectacularly successful. And so we looked actually with the help of an IMD consulting projects from MBA students where else to apply it. And we then ended up replicating the exact same program in Kenya, in Nairobi, with a different cultural setup, but with the same issues and with a similar result. And so that's, I think, one of the areas. And then the opportunistic area is when you do 1 or 2 investments, you become an expert and you learn a lot. And then it's much easier, to find and come to a positive conclusion on a third investment, which is similar, but also then to position yourself vis-a-vis the entrepreneur as somebody who can contribute. And so that's why we ended up over time to have deep expertise in this whole area of informal retail, last mile distribution, or in employable skills, or in kind of global value chains for niche agricultural products.
So I think that's very interesting because one of the problems many times for impact investors and philanthropic party investors is how costly the due diligence process is, and the transaction costs that come even before you start investing. So if you specialize and have some learnings that you can apply, still high transaction costs, but at least you start being more efficient than having to do full research on everything from scratch. And we have from Jürgen a question that goes to other parts of the definition. So we touch now on intentionality and this idea of having a focus, of specializing, and now he's asking what is the minimum or what is the range, I would add, that Elea invests, and I think it's very typical for philanthropic impact investors. And what is the risk-return relationship, if you think, and if you want, you can generalize here a little bit in what space is Elea Foundation, and if you want, in the life cycle or in the investment spectrum, is a philanthropic impact investor playing, and why?
Yes, and I mean, you referred to, Vanina, before to the cost of due diligence, and obviously that's significant, and that's actually one of the reasons why we call ourselves a philanthropic impact investor and not an impact investing fund, as many others, with a kind of either equal financial and impact goal or even a financial first approach. So we are philanthropic because we are looking for early stage companies. Early stage, I mean post-startup, so not business plans, not papers, not concepts, not prototypes, but we're looking for companies that already have clients, that have products, services, that have a business model, that have a team. They may have sales of maybe 500,000, 1 million, maybe 2 million. They may have a team of 10, 15, 20 people, but they are far from being stable in the sense of having a very clear strategic direction, from having a very solid and established organization, from having a a clearly defined leadership team, from having a clearly established governance model. And as a result of that, they need a lot of advice and support. And so as a rule of thumb, we essentially invest $1 for every dollar we invest in risk capital. We invest approximately another dollar into kind of advice, into strategy development, into organizational building, into governance, and in this year particularly also into helping the entrepreneurs manage the COVID crisis. And so our ticket size typically is maybe a few hundred thousand, maybe 300,000 is more or less the minimum that we do. 500,000, 600,000 is the maximum that we do. We are agnostic in terms of the form of the investment. Sometimes it's a grant if it's rather on the early side. Sometimes it's a convertible or a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, or it's straight equity for those that are a little bit further ahead. But for us, the important thing is to look at the impact and then to basically do what is the best in order to leverage the impact of a given investment opportunity.
We have a question from Derek, and maybe you can refer back also to the inclusive technologies or different things. But he's saying, how has the rapid digitalization of our economies in the past 15 years influenced your investment process and the impact investment priorities? So, and I would even say, have things speed up in the last year with COVID, and what role digitalization has played?
Yeah, a tremendously important role and a growing role. I'd say in two ways. One is in scouting for new investment opportunities. I mean, when we started 15 years ago, main sources were on one hand scouting tours that we did, where some of our associates went for 2 to 3 weeks into 2 or 3 countries and just looked on site what is around. We also worked with a series of development organizations with a long established presence locally, and obviously we had some increase of people who just approached us because of what they knew about Elea and also what they knew about myself and my career. In the meanwhile, with social media, we have become much more proactive and systematic in steering our source process that starts with desk research. And the good thing today with digitalization is before a venture has anything, they have already a website, they have a Facebook presence, they have a LinkedIn presence. And so it's actually very easy, even remotely, to find indications for social enterprises. And so how we do this today is we organize regularly evenings, research evenings, well-prepared research evenings, where 1 or 2 associates of our team prepare a few hundred kind of publicly available indications for ventures, and then we look at them and then we apply some of our criteria. And for those, and we do that in a kind of a little bit of a fun competition that we basically filter down a few hundred to then maybe 20, 30. And the next step then is to actually get on a call with those entrepreneurs to ask them, to see where they are, to test some early hypotheses. And then if the team is satisfied with the answers, what they develop is a peer, a preliminary investment recommendation, so a few pages, and then we decide whether we go into due diligence or not. And due diligence then is a resource-intensive process, as I mentioned, can take from 3 to 6, sometimes even longer months, and that is then about ideally going on site, which right now, quite frankly, is our biggest challenge because of COVID, because we can't travel. We have typically not made any decision without some members of our team having been on site and really become familiar with the business plan, but particularly also with the people around it in an intense and holistic way. So that's how we. That's one aspect, how we search and analyze new ventures, and then obviously also how we work together with them. And in COVID, I mean, we would never have thought that it would be possible to essentially do crisis management with many of our venture entrepreneurs completely remotely, with hours and hours and hours spent on Teams and Zoom and other devices. And then obviously the other big development is that the ventures themselves have become much more technology intensive. We right now are seeing many more distance learning kind of proposals from employable skill building providers, because of they had to essentially change within a few weeks what they were planning to do within a few years, going from physical training to distance learning, which is fascinating. I mean, it in some instances has done an enormous boost to creativity and imagination of the entrepreneurs, shown what's possible, also shown the limits. And also, for example, smallholder farmers now we see with increasing penetration of now even smartphones, not only Nokia phones, but also smartphones. We see a tremendous amount of business proposals that look at connecting suppliers and farmers through mobile phones with price information, with weather information, with kind of e-commerce marketplaces, peer lending approaches, and so on. So it's a huge momentum right now of digitally kind of supported business propositions.
Right. So thank you, Peter and Ivan. It was interesting. Last year we did. Peter came with us with IMD and a discovery expedition to Peru. I was thinking about this part of the due diligence that you were mentioning, and they had to evaluate a lot of the entrepreneurs before, and in many cases at the very beginning when they look at them on paper, very few of the entrepreneurs on paper look like they were investable, and they really mistrusted them. Actually, I remember when we gave the entrepreneurs to the executive MBA, there was a first email sending, okay, can you send me your pitch deck with your financials? And then an entrepreneur wrote to me, scared, saying, I'm not going to send all my financials to an unknown person. So how that part, that relational part that you need to build with your investees, because sometimes when you think about the traditional investing in Silicon Valley or venture capital, this can be in a different way. So how important is the relationship building, the partnership side between investor and investee?
Well, this is the essential part, and that's actually also the main theme of the book, because the main thesis when we were kind of designing what messages we want to convey with the book was, the notion that over the past, I'd say 20 to 30 years, we have seen two mega trends. On one hand, we have seen social entrepreneurship becoming an accepted and acknowledged characteristic of entrepreneurial qualities with organizations like Ashoka, like the WEF Leaders of Tomorrow, like the Skoll Forum, and based on this, entrepreneurs were identified, they were acknowledged, they were put on a pedestal, they were given awards, they were networked. And at the same time, or maybe a bit later in 2007, following, we have seen the impact investment industry developing as an asset class of its own, with by now about 500 billion committed capital raised through hundreds of funds. And the notion of the book is, we find many entrepreneurs who actually cannot deal with capital. They just don't know how to deal with it. I mean, it starts with very simple things of not having transparency of what their finances look right now, not being able to essentially doing a business plan, not trusting another person to do the financing for them, and not finding a CFO. And at the same time, we have lots of impact funds that actually are not really sure what impact is exactly and why, and what they should look in when they do due diligence, and how they should assess entrepreneurs. And that's essentially what we feel we have been doing and concentrating our efforts on since 15 years, which is bringing entrepreneurs and capital together. And this is a a very intense process, has a lot to do with trust, has a lot to do with working together. Typically, when we start with a due diligence, we reconstruct the financials together because often they're just not usable. And so typically when we invest, one of our conditions precedent is to get at least some person who is accountable for financing, because otherwise it will just not be possible to survive. And so it's very practical things, and you will have a section in the book which talks about these practical things like planning for a business, like developing an organization, like developing a team, like developing boards and governance, because they are at the end absolutely essential, on one hand, to make good use of capital, but also to attract kind of private capital. I mean, private capital wants to have some visibility of what people expect, what they want to achieve in terms of both impact goals as well as profitability over time. And so this is a very intense process, which obviously also is costly. And I think the industry right now is suffering a little bit from a lack of commitment to take over this cost. Because at early stage, even in very traditional venture capital, if you actually take a hard look at it, it is philanthropic, right? I mean, if you take the whole Silicon Valley industry and you just skip the top 1 per 1,000 real success stories that bail out everything else, then the rest is philanthropic, right? It needs people who absorb losses. And the difference between the area we are working in and Silicon Valley is we don't have these Apples and Amazons that at the end bail out thousands of failed enterprises. When something is successful in our world, it's maybe 5, 6, 7 times. So it may bail out, and this is obviously has to then absorb all the mentoring costs in between, and so it may absorb 2 or 3 losses, but not hundreds of them. But we feel that the industry is in need of more investment appetite into these kind of capabilities, like leadership skills, like planning skills, like organization skills, and so on. I mean, things that obviously you teach at IMD.
So we have several questions. Let me see. One is from Alejandra Hidalgo, and she's actually asking what the effects of COVID-19 can be, and if you expect really obligators default as a consequence of COVID crisis. Now, how do you see, obviously not for Elea only, but in general for the field, what do you think the effect would be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have the closest insight into our portfolio, which, as I mentioned, are about 20 different ventures. So far, touch wood, we haven't had a single complete failure. So yes, we have extended credit conditions. Yes, we had to sometimes recapitalize, put in emergency funding, but we have not seen an outright failure. We do see everybody in crisis mode, but the crises are very different. Some of our ventures, for example, those in last mile distribution, they were challenged by essentially much increased demands, and some have achieved real success stories. For example, in providing information on COVID and on measures to rural India. One of our ventures has, you may see when you take a look at the book, is Dharma Life. It's an organization that reaches 13 million Indians in the rural areas. And he was incredibly focused on, for example, providing hygiene information, hand washing, and giving some reliable information of what COVID is and what it is not. Others, particularly those in employable skill building, obviously were incredibly hard hit because they had to close their training facilities. Some were able to kind of in the short term replace at least part of it with distance learning, but they had a severe kind of revenue fallout and were therefore forced to kind of reimagine their business model. So it's a very mixed bag. I guess overall, we now have some kind of initial studies that estimate that a million people will be pushed back into absolute poverty, which is a tragedy. And I think it's particularly also a tragedy because this is not necessarily because of the virus. This is more because of measures of incompetent governments and weak institutions that were just not in a position to essentially help the poor people cope. And we have some countries that were just horrible in what they did. For example, just closing schools across the board, right? Which essentially is tragic for poor families, because then kids develop food problems, because school was typically the only place where they got decent food. They obviously lose a year in education. There is a trend of increasing child labor. The parents have less possibility to earn income because they have to care for the kids. So I think it's these measures, and they have a lot to do with kind of populist, incompetent government actions that are not well thought out and that are not implemented because the institutions are just not there to implement them.
We have actually two questions, one from Eric and one from David, that go through collaboration. And so let me read you both, but I think we can put them somehow together. And Eric is saying there are many NGOs in Switzerland, some of them working on absolute poverty and in the same countries and without collaborating themselves. Could you federate them? How could we federate or collaborate together? And that's one. The other from David is saying, how do you work with some of the other Swiss impact or development funds like Bamboo Finance or Responsibility, or are you an earlier stage, or do you co-invest? So I think both go to this idea. Do you collaborate with other impact investors? Do you collaborate in some way with NGOs? So what is the collaboration in this field?
Yes, this is a very pertinent question, highly relevant, and we have a full chapter in the book which talks about an aligned ecosystem, because I strongly believe that collaboration is one of those fields that is underexploited and that should be pushed harder beyond the kind of civil society sector to also include kind of large companies and also include public sector officials. We actually do increasingly look for collaboration, maybe less with NGOs because we are not an NGO ourselves. I mean, we are an impact investor. We do intensely collaborate with co-investors that may kind of have similar approaches, co-investing in similar ventures. For example, Shell Foundation is one of those organizations, or LGT Venture Philanthropy is another organization. The one you mentioned, Bamboo Finance, is a bit later stage. They would typically rather look at the kind of more mature venture organizations in our portfolio as potential exit candidates for us and investment candidates for them. But there is a whole area of looking for ways to also collaborate beyond the sector. For example, we do have a couple of very good experiences working with development finance organizations. We once did a program together with BIT, with the Inter-American Development Bank in Bolivia. We have several cooperations with DEG, with Deutsche Entwicklungsgesellschaft, and KfW, Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, where they match funding that we give. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, we have an investment where we provide the equity part and they provide the working capital part. And I think this is exactly where we should go. I think there should be models where different organizations work together across sectors, where they build bridges, where they develop trust. And to be very honest, this is an uphill battle because there is still this old dogmatically driven dichotomy where NGO feel that in principle large profitable companies are just bad and the other way around. And I think the more we can develop on good examples on collaboration across these different sectors, the better off the world will be. But it is challenging, it requires trust. And unfortunately, some of the political discussions we are having, for example, in Switzerland, the debate we had on the responsibility initiatives of large companies goes exactly in the other direction of essentially going back to the 1980s when I studied development economics and where everything was looked at through dogmatic lens, through either communist or capitalist lens. And in my book, one of the real big progresses that has been achieved in poverty and development economics was exactly to adopt this impact orientation. For example, with two Nobel Prize winners last year, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, who both looked at not whether it is right wing or left wing, but they looked at what works. And typically what works is a combination of market solutions and policy. And I think that's the direction we should go. But it's a highly promising area. It's challenging, but we feel this is the next frontier that we need to tap into.
And we at the Elea Center also believe in collaboration. Part of the research we're doing is on, for example, on blended finance, where you mix philanthropic, public, and private capital to find innovative solutions. But as we talk, if impact investing has had transaction costs, the moment you put a developmental financial institution plus an NGO, but then your due diligence, your compliance, your contracts, the transaction costs also go crazy. So it's becoming, the more you do it, the cheaper it becomes, and you need catalytic and actors that want to take on that risk. And I think we're seeing some very interesting, and we had a couple of webinars on that. And we're also collaborating, for example, with ICRC and Lombardo Die and the WEF on a humanitarian initiative to bring private capital to financing humanitarian causes. So I think there are very interesting things happening in the market, and these players, I think the mindsets are not only changing at the corporate level and introducing impact, but also at NGOs and thinking about efficiency, at revenue streams, at business models. And so we are seeing much more of a common language, I would say, coming into this. And we have a question, since you mentioned, I know we don't agree completely on this one, so I leave you on your own, but I think it goes to what you were talking, because we had, while writing the book, some of these discussions. But Paul is asking, development aid versus impact investing. What is your opinions of these two means of fighting poverty and bringing about social and economic development? Is impact investment trending because development has failed to deliver sustainable impacts? Very provocative, no? But
yes.
Since you were mentioning a little bit, I didn't think I should leave that question out.
This would obviously be another hour of discussion and debate. I can just tell you what our experience is. We have worked initially quite a lot with development organizations, traditional ones, partly left-wing ones, partly right-wing ones, with a lot of experience on site. And they have overall been good experiences. I mean, they have very competent project leaders. They do a lot of valuable work. We did one in Colombia, one in Peru, one in an African country, in Burkina Faso. What was similar across all of them was, as soon as your employed project leader leaves, the impact is fading. So you're always talking about a time horizon of impact of maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months, maybe 3 years. But that's about it. I mean, that is the time horizon of budgets of either public development aid organizations or even private organizations. And the key difference, if you invest in a social entrepreneur, and as you look at the book, you will meet some of those fabulous people, right? Like Gaurav Mehta on Dharma Life, or Divya Vasant in Amasi in South Africa. I mean, the key difference is an entrepreneur, he does not think months. He does also not think years. He thinks his lifetime. I mean, he thinks in generations and possibly beyond. And when you actually look back at how the Western capitalistic world has been created in terms of its welfare, it was the organizations, it was the entrepreneurs who built these big companies beyond generations, right? It was the Mr. Roche and the Mr. Nestle and the Mr. Brown and the Mr. Boveri, for example, to just call a few in Switzerland. So obviously we are not in the camp which basically says public development aid is bad, impact investment is good. I think that would be far too simple. But if you want to solve problems where a market solution, an entrepreneurial solution is available, then investing in an entrepreneur has just much more sustainability and a much longer term than a kind of temporary project which is financed for 1 or 2 years.
Right. So, and I think in that point, I agree to that. If a social innovation is available that can be brought to the market, even through philanthropic impact investing, that needs this push until it gets to commercial capital. And that's what we talk about additionality. I think we share that view that mobilizing private capital can be more effective and efficient. But I think that still leaves a lot of role for development aid. And I think development aid and DFIs also are becoming more and more catalytic, because they've been criticized a lot by these distortions of pricing or getting to clean energy, etc. So I think they're also changing a lot. And I think the collaboration can be very powerful, especially when we think of systemic changes. When we go a little bit more into the policy side, and you talked again about governments and corrupt policies and the problems that structural limitations can bring to the social entrepreneurs or the impact entrepreneurs. And let me just, because time is flying, God, like really almost there. I will have two very personal questions that I really like. So the only thing I'm going to have to ask you to be relatively short, but Mark is asking, what is an encounter with an entrepreneur during the last 15 years of Elea that you will never forget? You don't need to tell the name. It's like sometimes asking what of your kids is your favorite. No, but I don't know if there is something that you remember that is worth sharing with us.
There are many, but I think one of the encounters is certainly what I lived through when we were in Peru together. And we have an investment in Peru, which is called Economies, which is essentially a business which supports smallholder farmers up in the Andean Alps, 3,000 meters above sea level, to collect a very, very special moss, sphagnum moss, that is used for flower producers because it has unusual characteristics in terms of their bacterial characteristics and also their absorption of water. And I must say, when I met a lady, and she's actually described in the book as an impact story. That lady, she was a 53-year-old lady. She had numerous, obviously, kids and grandkids. She could, because of this business, acquire about $50 to $60 annually cash income that she didn't have before. And I mean, these smallholder farmers living up in the Andean mountains, they are really, really living under very tough circumstances in terms of nature, in terms of climate. They live on subsistence. They typically have a few goats and they grow potatoes, and that's about it. And when she mentioned to me that with these $50 that she earns, she can actually help kids buy school uniforms and books so that two of her grandkids can now go to school that they could not before. That was one of those moments of truth when you actually see the difference that this makes. And this entrepreneur, he was looking for years in Latin America for an entrepreneur who provided patient equity. He said there are plenty of people who provide somewhat subsidized working capital, which doesn't cost 30%, but maybe 18% or 12%. But there is nobody that he found who would basically give him patient equity, impact equity to build the business and expand this community work. And
I think that's part of what we want to convey with the book, that it takes patient capital, but also takes partnership and respect for the business model. That at the end, the innovation is coming from the entrepreneurs. So it's recognizing the value of their business models and their impact. And I think there is very nice and kind words from Wisa Bombo Joao. But there's a question at the end. I will send you the kind words later. But at the end, it's saying, we showed the prosperous past and all the successes from the Elea Foundation or the learnings from the past. He wants to know, or she, sorry, I don't know, want to know now what's your wish or your hope for the Elea Foundation in the next 5 to 10 years? So what's next?
Yeah, the initial step is that many people read our book.
You're good.
Because it was a lot of work, and I should give credit to Vanina for the name of the book. I would probably not have had the courage to call it the Elea way, but Vanina convinced us that this is a good title, and so then we really feel right now that this whole area of impact investing is becoming mainstream. I mean, it was a very much a niche kind of activity when we started 15 years ago. The fact that we did a class of more than 30 executive MBA students from IMD with a whole week in Peru on this topic, I think showed me that this is becoming mainstream. And quite frankly, my wish would be that within 5 to 10 years, this becomes a much more established segment of the market, that we have not half a dozen organizations that are doing similar things as we do, but maybe 200 on the planet, that we have a kind of an impact market that where you even can think about trading impact through tokenized kind of blockchain methodologies. So I just hope that this whole area will, I mean, in the last conclusions of the book, I write from discount to premium, right? I mean, today when you do this, people still sometimes look at you and say, well, I mean, wouldn't you want to go into a more interesting area also financially? I mean, today there are areas where there are actually premiums in trading. That's not yet the case for impact investing. I would hope that society over the next 10 years is prepared to pay a premium for those who contribute to essentially creating social benefits and fight poverty successfully.
So thank you very much, Peter, for this amazing experience of writing the book together, I would say, and also for helping me close the Elea webinars of 2020 that have been, I think, an invaluable experience for Patrick Reichhardt, the research fellow that is here with me, and for myself to bring in this IMD community and an external community together. And I think really at the IMD Elea Center, in line with IMD vision, no? Because I don't know if you know that the IMD vision is we challenge what it is and we inspire what it could be. I would add from us through social innovation. So we really want with the center activities and like these webinars, for example, we want to continue identifying and exploring opportunities available to social innovators and actually, again, bringing together players from this full social capital spectrum, from profit impact seeking enterprises to philanthropic capital, as we talk today. You know, so we ultimately believe that bringing these diverse actors together and engaging them in meaningful and thoughtful debate and tackling these global environmental social grand challenges is what it would help managers, activists, financiers to really make sense of purpose and have a greater impact on society. So that's part of the goal that we have at the IMD Elea Center for Social Innovation. And I want to thank you for an incredibly insightful and impactful year. And I really look forward to seeing all of you together in the near future in 2021 for the next part of the Elea, hopefully Elea content and webinars too. So thank you very much, everybody, and stay in touch. If you're interested on the book, please drop me an email and we'll make sure that you get one. And see you very soon. Happy holidays, stay safe, and see you in 2021. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Vanina.
Thank you, Peter.